Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And welcome to another author interview. My guest today is an experienced historian with a demonstrated history of working in writing and the editing industry. He also has a strong professional background in his BA, MA, and PhD focused in history from Queen's College, Cambridge, England. He is a historical detective, prize winning author, and engaging public speaker. And in this episode, which I must warn you, listeners, the book we're about to talk about is a heavy one. It is not for the faint of heart, so just warning for you there. It is investigating Babyn Yar, Shadows from the Valley of Death, which is the first comprehensive analysis of the largest mass shooting in history in which the Nazis killed and executed 33,000 Jews on September 29th through the 30th, 1941. And to provide us all the information behind that and a little bit more, is the author himself, Mr. Martin Dean. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Gabriel. It's a great honor. And I like the title, The Wandering Scribe, because I have quite a few miles behind myself as well. Crisscrossing, I lived in Australia for a while and did a lot of research in the Soviet Union or Russia, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. I've lived in Germany, Austria. Obviously, I'm from the UK originally, and now I'm resident in Washington, D.C. So I've got a bit of wandering behind me.
Nice, nice. And so before we dive into your book, Martin, what more can you tell us about your background and sort of like your historical journey?
Well, I was very fortunate that I knew roughly when I was about 12 or 14 years old, this is what I wanted to do. So I focused on history pretty much through school and especially in college. I got to my kind of aim college, which was Queen's College, Cambridge, and did a PhD there. The reason I chose Cambridge rather than Oxford was because you're able to more kind of tailor make your degree how you want it. Whereas in Oxford, they give you a kind of a syllabus that you have to go through. So I really sought out the best supervisors to train me. And I worked especially on my two favorite periods of the 18th century and World War II. And that's really what I've focused on mostly, particularly on the Holocaust in the last 20 years or so. From there, I was very lucky to get a series of jobs investigating and particularly working on war crimes cases in both Australia, Britain, and also I was an expert witness for a couple of cases in Germany. And so my training was really using original documents to get to the truth. My PhD was on Austria during the French Revolutionary War, so an 18th century topic. But again, there I found documents you wouldn't believe. I got a memo from the Austrian Chancellor explaining why he was going to continue the war. He was contradicted by the rest of the cabinet, but he insisted on fighting the war, and the war went on for about another 6 months as a result of that. This was tucked away in a miscellaneous file, and no one had cited it in historical documents before. So you can always find something amazing in the archives, is what I learned from that.
Holy mackerel, jeez. And it kind of almost goes like what you've also said in your bio, which is the most important thing is presenting history is to research thoroughly and to let the evidence speak for itself. And then going to your book, which I must say, thank you for sending me the PDF, because I'm just going to say right now, I have never felt more uncomfortable reading a historical book, a nonfiction book, in my entire life. But I honestly think that was the point. This is not a topic or not a subject that is for the faint of heart. It is brutal. It is up close, and it makes you feel kind of sick to your stomach, which I think is the point. It talks about a very dark moment in history. So if one you can give us like a brief exploit about your book and what it entails.
So the interesting thing is how I came across this topic. I mean, I worked on the Holocaust. I was actually an editor for an encyclopedia of ghettos, one of my main tasks, which I worked on for 10 years. So in that sense, I was a little bit toughened to the really horrifying stories you get. But even so, I'd never worked on Babyn Yar, which is kind of the biggest mass shooting in history, as you mentioned. And it takes place over just 2 days. And I was very fortunate that about getting on for 7 years ago now, I was invited to participate in the planned museum or memorial at Babyn Yar, which was preparing to build a new museum there, and particularly to research the history of that site. And so I became involved in a very large research project through the then chief historian Carol Burkhoff. And the aim was really to reconstruct the terrain of Babyn Yar. And you'd think, well, why does it really matter what the ravine looked like or exactly where it took place? The reason is that there's almost nothing left of that topography today. If you go there,
Really?
there's like one branch of the ravine that's actually quite a long way away from where the shooting took place, and it doesn't really look like what it looked like at the time. So all we had to work with were some photographs taken just after the shooting, and then we were fortunate also to get a topographical survey. So 3D modelers were able to sort of recreate most of it on the basis of that. But the aim was really to look at various key events or kind of signposts along the way and to understand what exactly happened there. And so I broke it up into little parts, and I have kind of chapters on various stages along the route. I don't necessarily do it all in chronological order. I'm more reconstructing the process of investigation that I had myself, the sort of gradual realization this is what really happened. I think in that way, I mean, it is very shocking for the reader, but I do try to avoid describing the most gory events. And part of it, I don't have many descriptions of that, and also it's not very enlightening. You don't want to just read pages and pages of what it's like to be shot. I think that the psychological element of it is I'm more following the people who are going there, and at the start a lot of them don't really know what to expect, and you sort of, as you travel with them, you get this horrible realization. I know that's kind of a cruel way to treat my reader, but at the same time it's very gripping. And actually I start with a totally different event, but it's linked at the same site. It's how we sort of first found out about this mass shooting, that there were prisoners kept in a concentration camp, or it was actually called a labor education camp, very close to the site. And just as the Germans were retreating, they got orders essentially from Berlin. A man called Blobel, who was actually in charge of the shooting, was then given the job of covering up all the traces of the shooting afterwards. And so what he does is he orders for prisoners from this camp, most of whom are themselves Jewish, to go and dig up the bodies in September of 1943, just 2 years after the shooting took place. And so I start with the perspective of these prisoners who are just taken out of the camp. They leave all their possessions behind. They're put into specially prepared bunkers in the quarry very close to the ravine where the shooting took place. And I kind of tell the story from their perspective as they start digging in the ground, and suddenly they come across some bodies, and suddenly they begin to realize what it is that happened there. And this is important because one of the aims of the whole project was really to find out and confirm exactly where the shooting took place. And there had been various theories about this, and there is a monument which stands about half a mile to a mile away from where I'm pretty convinced that it took place, but no one was really certain before. Although I think with all the evidence that I've put together from very different sources, from aerial photographs, from obviously a lot of testimonies, both of victims and some of the perpetrators, and then especially just tracing the route with the contemporary photographs. It all matches up very well. And part of the key to it is even the maps of that ravine are not completely accurate. I discovered that there was a quarry there, which was only created in the late 1930s or even as late as 1939. And we have evidence from aerial photographs that show mechanical diggers creating that quarry. And then we also have the pictures taken just after the mass shooting, where you can just see little bits of the quarry in the distance, but you see the main ravine, which is right next to it, where there are prisoners of war covering over what was most certainly the mass grave. And then at the end of the war, there's also one of the survivors from the concentration camp who had to dig up the bodies. He's standing on the edge of the ravine that still existed at that time and is pointing into it. The problem is, of course, after the war, the Soviets then bulldozed it all flat. So there's almost no references that you can use. Just a few things remain. There is a building from the Jewish cemetery that's still in the same place. And as I say, there's this branch from a ravine. If you overlay the maps, then you can start to piece it together. But the major discovery I made was this sand quarry. And that's particularly important because there are a number of photographs taken of that. And it took me about 3 months just really scratching my head and trying different versions to find out where these photographs were taken. They showed piles of clothes in the sand quarry. And eventually I was able to by measuring the height of individual people who are in the pictures to actually calculate the height of the cliffs. And I kind of excluded there being a sand quarry there because I thought it was just the cliffs were much too high. But then when you see this person standing on top, you realize the cliffs are only about 30 or 40 meters high and not 100 meters high. And on that basis, it was definitely the right place. So with the 3D modeling, they were able to confirm that. And there's some amazing work done by other colleagues putting together the photographs in the 3D models. A guy called Max Rockmanico did several videos kind of highlighting the story from that perspective. I tried to give it from the perspective, especially of the witnesses, that I worked through German trials. There were at least 3 major investigations, 2 of which went to trial in Germany. And in those, there were literally thousands of people were interviewed. And most of them, of course, don't remember very much about the terrain. They were there just for that one day. And they were trying not to remember it. And frustratingly, the lawyers or the judges were also not very interested in the terrain. They just wanted to sort of prove that it had happened and then get the people either to say their own role or try to obviously get them to describe the main people in charge. But I was very interested in the topography, and I did find that there were certain categories of witness who could help you with that. Some of the victims do describe various events along the way, and sometimes add in notes about lines of trees they passed through, or going up a slope and then down into the shooting site. And then there was one witness who talked about being shot from the very edge of the ravine. This was probably a bit of an outlier in the sense that most of the people were shot in the bottom of the ravine, but it does appear that in the evening, a number of people were shot on the edge and fell into the ravine. And actually they were among the main group of survivors because it was getting dark and some of them just fell in before they were shot, and then they were able to crawl out. So you can see this is kind of a gory story I'm piecing together, but trying to get away from any of this sort of denialist attitude and show that if you look at all the evidence carefully, you can piece together a very coherent story that matches up with all sorts of different types of evidence.
So with all this evidence that you've gathered and spending years to try to not only show, yes, this existed, but hear from the evidence that this is where the mass shooting took place, what is sort of the desire you want your reader to take away from? Like, what desire you're trying to satisfy for your reader who is interested into this story?
I think I'm looking for a reader that just really wants to know what happened and have it explained really clearly. I have a certain sort of dispassionate voice. I'm really presenting the evidence, as you say, just sort of sewing it together into a coherent story. And I do cut it up into little pieces to some extent because I think, firstly, it's too big to sort of digest as one big event. So I do go off a tangent in between to sort of break up the rhythm a little bit, more like a Shakespeare play. You have sort of different stories going on at the same time. And there are a lot of events to do with the ravine, both before and afterwards, that need to be mentioned. So especially afterwards, as I mentioned, there was the Soviet covering up of the ravine, the failure really to memorialize it for many years, and especially also the German efforts to cover things up. So all those things I go into some detail. I also look at the kind of the stories of the people who didn't get shot. So some people managed to escape from Kiev before the shooting, mainly before the Germans got there. Of course, once the Germans were there, it was almost impossible to get away. And those people get sent to places like Siberia, and they come back afterwards. So in some ways, their story is part of it because they lost their relatives there. Some had elderly relatives that stayed behind and who were shot. And they don't really find that out until they return to Kiev at the end of the war. And they also faced different types of discrimination at different times. Some of them are also struggling with some anti-Semitism in Kiev at the end of the war. Others are just struggling to survive. Several of them lost other members of their family, even in Siberia, where conditions were terrible, or fighting in the war, of course. So even for the Jews that managed to get out of Babyn Yar, World War II was a terrible catastrophe. And similarly, I look at the last days of the Germans in Kiev, and another big chapter is actually a lot of the other terrible things the Germans did while they're in Kiev. They had several different prison camps, forced labor camps. A few Jews were kept alive for a while to work in different labor sites. Particularly, there was a farm just down the road from Babyn Yar where some Jews were kept for a while. So just trying to piece together all these different stories. And there is this constant thread, of course, linking it back to Babyn Yar in one way or another. And I also tell the story in an early chapter of what happened to some of the German perpetrators on the way to Babyn Yar. And
right.
There, on a particularly unusual group, there was some very young Waffen S-men. They were just in their early 20s or even 19, 20. And they get kind of thrown into the frying pan just before they get to Babyn Yar. And some of them are involved in the mass shooting in different ways as well. And it seems to have a very traumatic effect on them. The only problem with those accounts is that these people really are not opening up after the war. They're not saying what happened. So in some ways, I tell their story through other people who spoke with them or who remember them being there. It seems these youngsters didn't want to talk about it after the war.
Fascinating. And with this story, we're trying to bring this to light. What is ultimately the promise you're making to them? And at the end, what do you hope your readers will experience and feel? Because when anyone who reads about any story of the Holocaust, the general feeling is, of course, anger, sadness, remorse, all of these things, which are rightly so. But for this story, what do you want the reader to experience and feel?
Yeah, I think there's definitely got to be a certain amount of sadness and just frustration at how terribly evilly conceived this whole thing was. It was a massive deception, and by revealing that and showing how only very gradually the victims themselves realized what was going on. And I do make a strange comparison at the end, which may seem unusual, but I see it very much as the forerunner of what's going on later on at the extermination camps, where also there was a lot of deception used. It was more mechanized there, but essentially you have the same process, that they're being deprived of their possessions on the route to the mass shooting. They're being depersonalized and gradually being put into a sort of narrow corridor, so there's no escape. And this is in some ways similar to the process of being put on a train to Auschwitz and then killed there. Except this was much earlier. This was the forerunner of it in the Wild East, so to speak, where things were obviously more chaotic. But there may have been some lessons that were learned there as well. And of course, this was only the first of very many mass shootings in the East.
Right.
It's often seen as kind of the archetype, but I would tend to argue it's a little bit different, mainly in this element of surprise, that they had only arrived in Kiev about 8 or 10 days before this shooting. And the Jewish population of Kiev was not very well forewarned, either by the Soviet government or even by the few refugees who made it to Kiev. And so they had kind of this advantage of surprise, which was fairly common in this period, in the summer of 1941 or beginning of the fall. But certainly when most of the mass shootings took place in 42 or 43, most Jews really knew that this is what the Nazis do, and
right.
that sense were more desperate and obviously better able to resist and try and flee in that sense as well.
There's a lot of stuff whenever we have like documentaries or like books that talk about the Holocaust, we think we know every avenue. But what this book shows for me is that there's a lot of other pieces that we don't know about that tie in to the greater story, and it does educate and does expand our mind. And kind of leading on to that, when you were sort of constructing this book, and of course you said you format them in sort of, it's still a chronological story, but it's not like truly chronological. There's like different parts here and there. And in that sense of telling this history, what was the initial feedback like when you constructed the first draft of this story?
I got quite a lot of positive feedback. Most people like the structure. I think I also keep it into fairly short chapters. There are a number of different reasons for having short chapters, that you give people a chance to have a break and decompressorize, and I say kind of switch their focus a little bit before you go back to the main story. And I definitely got positive feedback. There is a backstory to writing the book, though, which I should perhaps explain, because, of course, there is a war going on in Ukraine today. Most people are aware of that. And when I did the research, the war was just confined to these separatist regions. And I did my research on Ukraine before I kind of took the commission to work there. And I did go to Kiev actually only on 3 occasions between 2017 and 2022. But I did also take a good look at the site and talk to a lot of local historians and get access to some records that I would obviously not have got access to without doing that. But I did a lot of the research remotely. But we were initially planning to do a large project involving about 6 or 8 historians. But unfortunately, there was a change of emphasis due to pressure of time to get the memorial finished. So several of the other historians dropped out. And I was trying to negotiate a book contract with Karol Berkoff, the chief historian, but he also left the overall project in around 2020 or 2021. And so I ended up getting a contract to write the book on my own, which I got in about January of 2022. And then after 1 month of working on writing it, I got this letter saying that my contract was void because of force majeure, which means essentially a war. So I did write the book more or less on my own dime. I'd done, of course, the research before, and it just seemed necessary to me. I had it in my mind how I was going to write this book. I definitely want to get it out, and I wanted to dedicate it also to the brave people of Ukraine who were fighting for their freedom and their independence. The first draft of the book, I did have about 3 or 4 chapters blended into that, which described events in the war, and I think that's because I was experiencing them in real time. But I think reviewers in particular thought this was just a bit too much to cram into the book, and so in the end it got removed. And I just have, I think, the 1 chapter about war crimes in Ukraine currently as a kind of overlap to my own study of war crimes over many years before this. My first trips to Ukraine were to investigate war crimes that had happened during the Second World War, of course.
Fascinating. See, this is what I love talking with authors and learn about these books, especially historical books, because it really helps me understand different aspects of history. And kind of speaking on that aspect of history, kind of jumping ahead, what would you say is among the many reasons for creating this book? What would you say is probably like your biggest why and motivation for bringing this book life? Like, why would you say it is necessary that we talk about this book? Why should people know about this book? And generally, for the general public speaking, why should we care?
Well, for me, it was just clear that there were so many aspects of this event that were not properly investigated. People hadn't even identified the right site. And I think I can put the story together in a way that no one has done before. So it's a story that needs to be told. It's one of the most important stories of the Holocaust. It's certainly the biggest and one of the earliest mass shootings in the East. And to understand it properly, we need to look at it in more detail and more carefully. And I think, of course, it's a very painful story, but I was surprised how much of a coherent image I could put together. And it was so much better than what I'd read before from other places. Of course, I've borrowed a lot from good researchers, but just by putting different perspectives into the same book. So the aerial photographs tell you a lot of things that you can't get from any other sources, but no historians had really used aerial photographs effectively to look at Babyn Yar before. And that overlaps, of course, with the problem of the site today, which looks very different. But again, the aerial photograph helps us to understand how the site was and how it's changed. And then I looked at masses of witness testimony. And really what I was trying to do was something completely new, which is to locate the testimony in the geography of the landscape, so that you can almost say this person must have been standing roughly here when he experienced this or that. And I mean, it would be nice to do it actually on a map as well to sort of get that other side to it. My colleague Max Rukmaniko was to some extent trying to do the same sort of things. He also built real 3D models, so not only a kind of topographical 3D model, but he reconstructed scenes from those days at Babyn Yar as 3D models, and even also the concentration camp afterwards. As a historian, I had some problems with that because there's a certain amount of imagination necessary there, and
right,
to get the right feel for it. But as a task, I was happy to work with him and sort of give him my feedback. And that was another exciting part of the project, was not only to be giving my version of the story, but helping to tell this story to a much wider audience through things like 3D models and videos. and eventually a museum was planned. Unfortunately, of course, because of the war, the museum has definitely been put on ice for a while, but I'm very much hoping that one day that will be completed in the manner it was intended.
Fascinating. So pretty much, like as you've been telling, like almost all these different avenues came together to create this book, from the photographs, aerial photographs, topography, which I think often gets overlooked in historical studies, especially whether it's classical history, medieval history, or even modern history. No one really takes it into consideration, but it is generally important because the geography back then is not what it is now, and it is kind of like it's like a huge crime scene. Well, this is a crime scene because you're trying to find, where did this place exist? We know it exists. We have the records. We have the testimonies, but where specifically is it? There's so many conflicting things. So when reading this, also, it is kind of almost like it is a crime story, but it's almost like you're trying to figure out, as the reader, trying to figure out, oh, wait a minute, is this it? Or, oh, wait a minute, this leads to this. So it's all putting the pieces together. So I guess kind of in like that, how did you sort of like balance it to make sure you yourself, when writing this, didn't get confused, and to make sure that all the little strings came together perfectly?
Well, I think the sort of chronology does help a little bit. Essentially, I'm getting closer and closer to the heart of the matter, where the main events took place, and I'm sort of describing various stages along the route. But the most important thing was that by the time I started writing, I had this very clear in my mind, and I'd literally been grappling with it. When I started out, as I think I say, I didn't even know how I was going to do this, let alone what the answer was. So it was definitely
Right.
a journey, as kind of a quest, a research project that I'd been set, that I wasn't going to let go. And that's often how my books kind of eventuate, that I don't necessarily, with my first one, I did kind of choose it myself, but even then, when I worked on Austria in the French Revolutionary Wars, the idea for that was actually a present from my father on my birthday. And I'd never read anything like that before, so I thought this would be great to research it and find out what really happened. What surprised me with that was that so much had been written before, and that even though I was reading several thousand-page books just to get started, eventually I did find a few things that nobody had discovered before, just by digging deep in the archives and seeing what comes out. With this book, of course, it is a difficult balancing act to sort of gradually feed pieces of information to the reader and still not leave them confused, but so that there's a bit of repetition in it. I think that's necessary in a way, because you have to also feel that you know your way around the topography, and that it all makes sense. And most of the images do help a lot. I have about more than 50 photographs altogether, so people can sort of visualize things as well as just thinking it through in their head. I should perhaps show the book here so people can see it. It has a
very nice,
important photograph on the front. This is really the photograph that started it all. When we had a meeting in Kiev, Karol Burkov kind of put this photograph in front of us and posed the questions of, where was this taken? What are these people doing? And that's kind of how I did my research as well, to answer those questions.
fascinating. And now, kind of going into more of like the writing process, and talking to you now as the writer side. What would you say is sort of like your reasons to write? Like, what motivates you to write? And kind of like as a tie into this question, what historical authors would you say have been big influence on your writing style? Because I always think when we write, we always try to find like our own writing voice, and we read books that we are generally interested in to see how they write, how they present discussions. So can you tell us a little bit about that side of you?
I think I've been very lucky, because I most of the writers I really admire, I know personally. I've been to their lectures, I've read their books, I've asked them questions, I've been on trips with them. So that's a real benefit of having the sort of privileged historical career I have had, that even as an undergraduate, I had some of the best historians teaching me. And then again, as a consultant or working with especially legal cases. I particularly work with Chris Browning very closely. I think that might be a name you've heard. He's most famous for a book called Ordinary Men. And I actually first met him around the time that book came out, and we worked together over about 10 years altogether. I had other inspiring writers more recently. Obviously, Jan Gross is famous for Neighbors. I got to know him for a little while at least, and he tends to write very short books, again, with sort of short chapters, but sort of very punchy, very dynamic stories, and a real strong message. And I think that helped me to sort of find my own voice. But I am also fortunate in a way that I've had a career. For about 10 years, I did mostly investigation, and I wasn't supposed to write very much. I just wrote a couple of historical articles. But then I actually started becoming very prolific. I wrote a couple of books in about a 10-year period. So one on collaboration in the Holocaust, sort of reworking my war crimes investigations more from a general historical point of view to just explain how local police units in Belarus or Ukraine became involved in the Holocaust and actually played a quite important role, which was really not so well known at that time. And then my other book was called Robbing the Jews. And that was really an assignment I'd been given by my then employer, the Holocaust Memorial Museum. They wanted research on really how the process of confiscation and robbing took place. And that was, again, a big investigation in the sense that lots of it was fairly well known, but there were little pieces here and there that hadn't been researched. And I spent about 4 or 5 years in archives kind of chasing down those unknown parts. I actually tell the story for the whole of Europe, so that's a pretty ambitious.
Ooh, okay.
That I'm telling the history of about 15 different countries and comparing and contrasting them. So I'm used to the idea of writing quite long books and going into a lot of detail. I then spent a period of time working on an encyclopedia of the Holocaust, an encyclopedia of ghettos. And I was mainly an editor there. I was also effectively writing 1 or 2 entries a week myself. And I got used to the idea of being able to not only deal with this topic, but try to tell it in an interesting way. And especially, I always look for those little details that didn't quite match up. Sometimes I would be editing someone else's work, and there was just some question that nagged me, and I would go in, find some way, either by looking at maps or by finding new testimonies or just trying to get the chronology right. Maybe someone got the year wrong. And those were the sort of things I was working on as an editor. So again, I was solving historical questions as an investigator in my mind. So this is what I try to do with my books, is keep the audience interested by sort of showing not only what happened, but the process of finding it out, how you really have to stick with it and keep asking questions to get the right answers.
And that's, I think, only at the end for all historians, that's only what we're trying to do when we teach history. We're trying to present the information that we found, but let the reader come to the conclusion on their own. We could spoon feed them the information, but would they really actually learn from it? Will they take away anything? And kind of still on this topic, when you were writing this book, did you have a particular reader in mind? And would you say that you would write for yourself when you're writing your books, in the sense that if these were the books that you saw in stores, these are the ones that you would want to buy and read? Or would you write these books for those of the same interest or your ideal reader?
That's a very good question. I think most of my books are academic books. They have a lot of footnotes, and they really have a detail to them, which perhaps the average reader is not necessarily looking for. But I don't write them in a complicated way. I try to have it in a very straightforward way. In this book, I used a lot of quotations, which is sort of giving you that immediacy that you're almost there with the people describing what they recall or what they saw. And in that sense, I think I am aiming, particularly with this book, for a broader audience. I try to package it in an intriguing and interesting way. So just starting the story, it's a bit of a mystery. The people have to figure out for themselves what's going on for the first few chapters. And I think in that way, I'm trying to draw the reader in. And obviously, it's mostly for historians and people interested in this very story, but I'm hoping also that someone who knows nothing about it will get quite a lot from it. They probably have to read the introduction, which will prepare them a little bit for what's coming.
Yes.
Even so, there's a sort of dynamism to the story. I mean, as you say, it is quite shocking. My wife read it and was kind of having a hard time getting through it, but I think that's because she's not so used to this kind of a very detailed history of such a terrible event.
Definitely. And I had to reread it again because it's so fascinating. And I love how there is information that gives you the backstory, but it doesn't overwhelm you with the information. It provides just enough where the reader can understand and it's a tragic story, a very like gut-wrenching story. And as you said, it's not an intensely like gory where it talks about like the truly descriptive violent things, but it messes with your mind and it really tries to make you think like, wow, this happened not that long ago. That you had like regular people, your neighbors at one time, rounding you up, and this is what happened. And I can't even imagine like interviewing the people who survived that or were a part of it. Like that's like reliving a trauma. And ultimately going back to the original question at the very, very beginning, where it's like when you create your book and like the promise you're making, when the book finally came out, finished, it was polished, did you feel or do you feel that your promise has still been honored, that the initial promise that you made when creating the story is still the same promise in the final book?
I think you're right. You do have a different kind of attitude and distance to it, and I haven't sort of reread it for the last couple of months actually, but I was very happy with it when I presented the manuscript. I made a few last-minute changes. I have to confess that I had a peer reviewer, and she did a fantastic job. And unfortunately, it was a lady I know pretty well, and we've always had good discussions about these things. And she just made some very useful suggestions, particularly about the introduction, and especially also about embedding the photographs more closely into the narrative, so that
Right.
when I say photograph, it's not just an illustration; it's really a piece of evidence that you walk the reader through, so that they can see the things that are there and see how it fits into the whole story. So there was some very good feedback towards the end, and that made me feel very confident on finishing the book. And certainly to get it in your hands is, of course, is another thrill again. And I'm very happy with the book. It looks really good.
It is, honestly. And again, as I said, I had to reread again because it is just so good. And it just blows my mind that there, as I said in the beginning, there are still pieces of this dark part in human history that we know very little of. We think we know everything. We have accounts, we have documents, we have testimonies, we have interviews. We think we know everything about the Holocaust. And what this book shows to me as a reader is that there's still pieces that are forgotten, that have been overlooked, and that need to be included into the general discussion. And kind of on that line, what would you say your book, what would you say, to try to word this, as a reader, what books would you say should be included into this discussion of Babyn Yar? So if someone read Babyn Yar, what would you say as like a reference read to help continue this discussion, as almost like the unofficial sequel or follow-up?
There are a number of books, and particularly in recent years, this eastern part of the Holocaust has become better documented. I get on particularly well with a man called Father Patrick Dubois, who's actually a French priest, which may seem like a strange way to come at this thing. He's actually spent the last 20 years, or more than 20 years now, investigating these kind of mass shootings all over Eastern Europe. He has expanded it more recently to cover things in the Middle East as well, particularly the fate of the Yazidis there, which is also a tragic story. And he sends out teams of investigators just to speak to the very last witnesses, who are, of course, now in their 90s or older, but a few of them are still able to recall things. And he has a couple of books which, in a similar way, are trying to reconstruct local events and see patterns in how the Nazis were organizing these things. And it's particularly focused on this kind of ignored aspect of the role of the neighbors. What did they see?
Right.
Were they complicit or try to help the victims? And how can we understand and really, first of all, show that these things really happen, because there isn't so much evidence and there's not so much written about it, but also to sort of get into the details of why and who was on which side, and especially where these things happen, so that it's all documented for historians in the future. And I admire his work a lot, mainly for the interviews, because the historian, I've done a few interviews, but I know that if I were to spend my life doing interviews, I probably wouldn't get much written. So I tend to go to archives where, if you're lucky, you can get dozens of stories in a day or two. Obviously, they're not so immediately kind of in front of you, but I rely a lot on particularly legal investigations, and there are enormous archives in Germany of legal investigations, and I was one of the pioneers for the Soviet legal investigation archives. I actually got access in the 1990s to KGB trials and other investigations which had never been seen by anyone from the West before. So that really showed me that there's a lot more to this than people thought. Putting those together with other sources, as say like photographs and aerial photography, you can get actually a very nuanced idea of what happened, which it seemed so impossible just a few years ago.
Definitely. I 100% agree. Now, going on to like the last few questions before the final question, when constructing this book, who would you say have been like your biggest supporters in this journey of yours?
I got encouragement from a lot of different people. There were some early peer reviewers I recruited myself. A guy called Tom Friedel, who's written some pretty amazing stuff himself, and particularly about Poland, and another researcher in England, Stephen Tyas. They both helped me, and then especially the peer reviewer, Hilary L. I also got encouragement from other academics like Peter Hayes, Chris Browning, Mark Roseman. My wife, of course, has been very supportive. And just little bits of feedback here and there are always very helpful. You definitely do need people on the journey with you. And most of all, of course, the colleagues I work with doing the initial research. There were some amazingly dedicated Ukrainians who would spend more or less their lives helping to uncover these details. There's a historian named Alexander Kruglov. For a long time, I only knew him via email. We would kind of exchange at least 2 or 3 emails a week, and eventually I got to meet him. He doesn't speak much English, and my Ukrainian or Russian is pretty bad, but we did communicate German quite a well. And he's kind of a model for me. He's very matter of fact, but he just says this is how it was. And I have seen him get kind of emotional one time when someone was kind of using the wrong number of victims for a particular crime. And he said, of course it matters. You have to be true to the victims. You shouldn't exaggerate it. You shouldn't underestimate it. It has to be as accurate as you can be. And he showed that he really cared about getting to the truth. And that's very much my attitude as well.
Fascinating. That is actually really, really amazing. And kind of going along this line, like the support, as you say, because it is important to have people with you on this journey, because writing a book, especially a book like this, it is a long and tedious and very lonely journey. You're putting hours and hours into research. You're trying to construct the story. And there's always that little voice in the back of your head saying it may not be good, or there's going to be some harsh critics. And you're pouring your heart and soul into a project that you feel people should know about. And so when you finally constructed this story and you finally told people, as you mentioned before, the feedback was incredible. It was positive. And then when you finally got the beautiful cover showing this is what happened, have you ever gotten a sense of validation from fellow historians who not only have worked in the same field or discussed the same topic, but also other historians that are not necessarily in the same field, but found this discussion thought-provoking and important?
Yeah, I have had a lot of positive feedback, and from both highly respected historians to just ordinary people who hear me give a lecture. They'll come and thank me afterwards for what I'm doing, and that's always important, that you feel what you're doing it is important to other people. It does change people's lives, and it means that these long hours, as you say, that can seem thankless, have a meaning to them. I think I've been very lucky with the topics that I've worked on with war crimes investigations in the Holocaust, that I never had any kind of cognitive dissonance about doing it. This was always what seemed to be right, to try and get people to understand what happened, and to some extent, not necessarily correct the wrongs of the past, but lay them bare so that people can't deny them or lie about them.
Perfect. well spoken. And we're nearing towards almost the end of the interview. So I'm going to ask you, Martin, probably the most important question I always ask my guests is, what is your word of wisdom to authors who are also historians writing about an historical topic, no matter what it is? What is your word of wisdom to those who are starting this journey of theirs or starting a project that they feel needs to be discussed?
Yeah, I think certainly it's self-confidence. Never give up. Believe in yourself, and especially in your own conception of how the book should be. I felt with several projects, people have suggested you might do it this way, or certainly to narrow it down is often advice given, say, to PhD candidates. But if you have a really clear idea, you just have to go for it and stick with it. Of course, it has to be well thought through. You definitely want to listen to people who have suggestions. And think about it and sort of let the ideas gestate. Sometimes with writing, you just have to put it away for a couple of days and come back to it and see, well, does it really read good now, or do I still have to work on this? But essentially, you need to follow through with your original conception and be true to yourself in your writing.
I could not agree more, because I think as authors, we want to have our voice. We want to share it with everyone. We want to tell stories, because us authors, historians, we're storytellers. We want to tell stories. Sometimes the stories we tell are motivating. Sometimes the stories we tell deal with trauma. They bring up horrible things, but they are important to tell. There's one quote I remember from one professor who I spoke with on the show a while ago, which he said, history or teaching history is like taking or like swinging a baseball bat into someone's face. It's going to hurt. You're going to feel pain, but it's going to be up in your face and you have to deal with it. And it's how you approach it. And whatever happens, how you approach it, that is what matters, because we need to tell the truth. It's going to be painful. It's going to be messy. History is not supposed to be squeaky clean. It's not supposed to be straightforward. If history was straightforward, we would know everything. Everything would be documented. We would know all the truth. But then we don't need to document anything because everything's all presented. There's going to be pieces of history that, in this case, Babyn Yar, which I did not know about until I met with you, Martin, that need to be discussed. At the end of the day, with everything, history has to be preserved and it has to be discussed. But most of all, it needs to be truthful, because if you don't portray history truthfully, it's fiction. And we already have that. And with that, listeners, this concludes this very powerful interview. I want to extend a huge thank you to our guest, Mr. Martin Dean, for joining us and providing his knowledge and the journey of bringing Babyn Yar to life. And before we officially end today, Martin, are there any other projects that we should be on the lookout that you are working on? Any collaboration with other historians? What should we look for in the future?
I have one project I've already started on, and this is really going back to my own war crimes investigations. I was involved in three pretty amazing cases, and I want to kind of tell those stories, and in some ways they're also intertwined. I've not got so far, but I have a rough structure. I'm working on the first of what's going to be a trilogy, and I think it will be also quite gripping and very interesting for the reader. So I hope that some of you will be able to catch up with that before too long, and we can carry on the journey, getting to the bottom of what happened during World War II.
Awesome. And Martin, where can people find a Babyn Yar if they want to purchase their copy?
It's definitely available on Kindle from Amazon. You can get a hard copy, which is a little expensive right now, but there will be a paperback fairly soon. And it's also available directly from the publisher Lexington Books, which is based in Lanham, Maryland, very, very close to where I live. I'm also on LinkedIn. There are several videos of me presenting about Babyn Yar on YouTube, which are pretty good. And there I use extensive visual aids, so maps and aerial photographs to tell the story. And otherwise, I have a couple of other books that you can also get either from the library or from Amazon. Collaboration in the Holocaust, and also Robbing the Jews, I recommend.
I will link those all down below to those who want to check them out. I'll also link Martin's LinkedIn profile if you want to reach out to him to know more about Babyn Yar, if you just want to discuss and talk with him to learn more. And again, listeners, thank you so very much for joining us today for this very thought-provoking and powerful author interview. Again, I want to extend a huge thank you to our guest, Mr. Martin Dean, for joining us today. Martin, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling the world about Babyn Yar and why we need to discuss it.
Thank you again for having me. I was an honored guest, and especially for your excellent questions, Gabriel. It's great to work with you, and hopefully we'll be seeing each other again before too long.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you all listeners too for joining me today. And without further ado, this concludes our interview. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out.